Looks like we are ready to go. So I appreciate everyone who has made time to be here. And I would like to note at the beginning that the chat section is turned off, but we have a Q&A section that should be available in the bar at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So if you would like to send in questions during the presentation, we're not going to respond live, but Val and I, one of the other members of the Center for Peace and Development here, are going to collect those questions, and we will pose them to Doctors Hsieh and Kramer at the end of the presentation. So we also feel strongly that knowledge about this topic can strengthen our communities and lead to a more sustainable world. So that is very, very important to us, and we are glad that you chose to attend this webinar. The webinar is only possible because of a group of folks who care very deeply about making our world a more serene and equitable and livable place, and that would be the OU Center for Peace and Development, as well as the Security and Context Initiative. So we're very grateful for them for sponsoring this event. If you want to follow or get involved with the work of these organizations, you can find more information by simply searching for their names in Google, Facebook, or Twitter. And again, that's the OU Center for Peace and Development and the Security in Context Initiative. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce the first of our two co-presenters, Dr. Elaine Hsieh, and I believe that my co-moderator Val will be introducing Dr. Eric Kramer in just a moment as well, if we can get our technology working. Otherwise, if we are encountering problems there, I will quickly do an improvisational introduction for Dr. Kramer too. But Dr. Hsieh is professor in the Department of Communication here at OU, also a visiting professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she is also an award-winning author, a Fulbright scholar, and an NIH-funded researcher. She's published extensively to examine the intersections of culture, language, health, and medicine in interpersonal and cross-cultural contexts, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to learn from her personally here at OU. She's an incredibly kind and brilliant person whose research is always aimed at creating a better world, so we are very happy to have her here. Also, it seems like because of the settings, my co-moderator Val is not going to be able to hop into the video section here, so I did not prepare a specific introduction for Dr. Eric Kramer, but he is also here with us. Dr. Hsieh's co-author on the book that's going to be discussed today, Presidential Professor of Communication, also here at OU with research specialities in intercultural and cross-cultural communication and phenomenology. So we are very happy that he is here to talk with us as well. And those are the wonderful folks who are going to be speaking with us. And I'm going to let Drs. Hsieh and Kramer take it away.
Let me start by sharing my slides that we prepared earlier. Does everything work fine? Okay. Yes. Thank you. So our topic today is cultural attitude and vaccine resistance, and the foundational work in thinking about how do we solve the problem or understand the problem, if not solving it, of vaccine resistance. We use our book, which is me rethinking about how can we understand culture in health communication or communication in general. And our book is published earlier this year in March 2021. In there, we were able to include a lot of discussions about COVID, and we kind of think it through over the process of writing the book together. And predominantly, we also rely on Dr. Eric Kramer's theory on the theory of dimensional accrual and disassociation to understand how can we rethink culture now that is beyond sort of minority groups or ethnicity or nationality, but to understand culture as something that structure our understanding about relationship and our understanding of reality. So one of the first things that we know about vaccine resistance is that people are not necessarily ignorant about the effectiveness of vaccines. That these are the headlines that we see, that people are motivated, they want to get vaccine, but somehow the only way for certain groups of people in our society to get it is to disguise their identity. And so in other words, somehow getting vaccine is problematic. As a vaccinated identity is problematic for these individuals, maybe in their community, presumably, or their social network. When we think about historically what public health has done in convincing people to adopt behavioral change, their strategies tend to focus on, for example, cost-benefit analysis. I am going to increase your perception of the benefits in getting this particular vaccine. I'm going to tell you how effective this vaccine is, how long it will help you avoid COVID, how much it would benefit you for not paying medical bill. I'm also going to try to reduce barriers. So I'm going to have mobile clinic. I'm going to make vaccine easily accessible to people. Sometimes we also, more recently, you hear people talking about having community-based campaigns. In other words, we recognize that different communities may have different belief systems. So we say, maybe we need to address African American communities' medical resistance, how they're concerned about the larger community, the larger society may not be fair to them. How do we make them trust medical professionals so that they would accept the campaign that we're offering? So typically we offer tailored messages as communication scholars. We talk about how can we change their behavioral belief, tell them that getting vaccine is good. It will not make you magnetize you into a new being. You won't change your DNA, RNA. And we tell them that, a lot of people have gotten vaccinated. They're more normative belief, what other people do. We tell them that, it's common practice, most Americans support it. So you should just be like everybody else. Don't feel all like, join the crowd. This is what we do to protect each other. And or that we try to talk about the severity. So you see the news talking about how severe people's COVID is, talking about how susceptible, how more transmittable this new Delta variant is. These are all traditional public health campaign strategies in trying to motivate people to change. But the current situation is that it's clearly demonstrating that a big chunk of our people in our society are vaccine resistant, and they certainly know about this, right? That they are certain that there are enough information for them to witness the number of people who died, that it has surpassed 1918 Spanish flu, but they are not changing their mind. Or that somehow, even as they decided that they want to get vaccinated, they don't want anybody to know that they are vaccinated. So here is what's going on within their social network. One of the puzzles we face is that why is it that people are fearful that their vaccinated status will be known? So much so that they would disguise and hide their vaccinated status. Now, more and more places are requiring people that they need to show vaccinated record in order to go to restaurants, to receive certain type of business. But if these people went so far to disguise themselves when they're getting vaccine, these people will not flaunting their vaccinated record around in their community and tell people that, to create identity of the vaccinated identity. And the question is, why? Why when you show your proof of vaccination, you can attend schools, things get so much easier for you. Why aren't you making these decisions? here is where we start our thinking about sort of this perceived social norm, right? Historically, what public health campaign does is that we want to correct people's understanding of social norm. So for example, we tell college students that their perception of how many people binge drink is too high compared to actual reality, or that we tell them that they're actually more susceptible for flu than they personally believe that they are. So we're trying to correct these beliefs about the social norms, like what's happening in the world. However, in this book, we argue that this kind of understanding of like if I provide the accurate information about how transmittable Delta variant is, how popular the vaccine is in the larger community, is not going to be helpful, because depending on a person's cultural attitude, they're going to have very different understanding about the meanings and functions of social norm. In other words, we're arguing that people with different cultural consciousness understands their realities and their relationship with their members of their communities in such a different way that they would lead to very different behavioral intentions and motivations about what they want to do with their health behaviors. And with that, I want to sort of provide the introduction about Dr. Eric Kramer's theory of dimensional accrual and dissociation. Actually, I think I have a typo. It's dissociation, not disassociation. Dissociation. And it's a different, historically, when we talk about culture in health comm, we tend to think about culture as sort of a caveat. You know, this is what people do, but Chinese people do it differently. Americans do it this way, Japanese people do it this way. Dr. Kramer sort of stepped out of that ethnicity, nationality frame, or even minority status frame, and think about how culture as a conceptual framework create a different way of understanding between our identity, our relationship with other members in our community, and to our larger reality, like social reality. And in the book, we propose that there are 4 different types of cultural consciousness. There's magic consciousness, mythic connection, perspectival thinking, and fusion is a particular type of cultural consciousness that presents a mixture of the first 3. These cultural attitudes are not defined by nationality or ethnicity. Rather, they're defined by how we conceptualize our relationship with other people, which then lead to our obligations to other people in social context. So Dr. Kramer will discuss the next slide.
Hi. Yeah, my background, part of my background comes from telecommunications. That's what my PhD is actually in. And initially I was studying the semiotics and hermeneutics of advertising. So I've always been very interested in persuasive messaging, not just classical rhetoric. And when we face a problem about how to convince people, for instance, to take the vaccine, there are several issues. And I was looking at many, many theories, and I was trying to put all of the different theories into a more fundamental set of first principles. So I went back to look at neo-Kantian theory, and I'm not going to get into that. But I was looking at Lewis Mumford on dissociation, which essentially means how much do people care, and Jean Gebser's work on structures of consciousness. A lot of this is presumed in many, many theories. So for instance, in Intercultural, we have theories on linear and cyclical time, theories on high context, low context communication, theories about high power distance, low power distance, affectivity, affective neutrality, all these kinds of theories that are out there, individualism, collectivism. But from basically 3 or 4 different structures, each one sees all of those variables, but it sees them differently. And so we were thinking about how difficult it is to try to convince people to take the vaccine. And one theory I was looking at was crisis management theory. That begins with the work of Ernest Becker, and Becker is saying, well, when you talk about death, people get very anxious. And so he talks about death denial. And he says that, for instance, if you're talking about COVID and the fact that it could kill you, this could actually drive people back into their comfort zone, back into the rhetoric and the concepts, the conceptual frameworks that make them feel good, rather than drawing them out to suggest a modification of their behavior. When we look at other theories about behavior, there's still a lot of value in looking at things like the relationship of values, attitudes, and beliefs to behavior, and things like groupthink. I was looking at that too, but when I came back to my own theory, and I was looking at magic consciousness, that theory would dictate that what's really happening here is not cognitive dissonance, it's affective dissonance. It's not groupthink, it's group feel. It's not logos or pathos or ethos. I mean, it's pathos. And that's really the crux of the powerful advertising and PR industry. And so you have to start to look at it that way. And I was reading Lakoff, who is a linguist, and Lakoff sort of squared off against Frank Luntz. Frank Luntz is the guy who is most famous for framing Republican rhetoric. Lakoff, at the time, was at Berkeley. He was trying to help Democrats reframe debates. So, for example, Luntz would say, well, you shouldn't refer to looking for oil. You should talk about looking for energy exploration, things like this. And Luntz has proved to be very successful at reframing rhetoric. But I tend to come down on the side of Schlafer and some others who say that Luntz and Lakoff have gone to their respective corners, to their tribal languages. And this is really the problem. So I ran across a very interesting study that showed that if you show a transcript, read or show a video of a political speech given back in the 1960s to Republicans and Democrats, and you blank out the speaker, they can't tell if it's a Republican or Democrat because they were speaking the same language. And that language, as Lakoff would say, did tend to harbor values, beliefs, and attitudes. Fast forward to the 2000s, you run the same experiment and people can almost immediately tell which side gave the speech. Well, what does this tell us? This means that we have become more and more polarized on the way we're framing issues and the language we're using. And this is problematic. So it seems that we have to return to more fundamental common ground that would go to not threatening people, but trying to find our common fears and our common hopes. If you want to convince people, and this means we have to find a third language, a language that is neither Democratic or Republican, because this has been so politicized. And I think that would be the way forward. Now, I'm not talking about being cynical and manipulative here necessarily. I'm talking about a sincere attempt in terms of mythic connections. And this is where shared values really live. Mythic connections are in the stories we share. And we still share a lot of stories. If we can find that common ground before it is destroyed. But there are concerted efforts, and we have to be clear-eyed about that, by very smart people to pull us further and further apart. Some of it is coming out of psyops in Russia. They're very good at it. In other words, some of it is offshore, threatening us through the internet and other things. Some of it is a sort of fifth column within our own country. So I would urge people to start to find the common myths that still bind us and the language there, because this is not an issue of cognition as much as it is an issue of shared emotion. Because that's where our values and our beliefs and our attitudes really manifest and drive our behaviors. So for instance, I had someone come to my house. He was not vaccinated. He would not wear a mask. He was doing some repair work. And I asked his office, is he vaccinated? Will he wear a mask? And they were very kind of nasty to me. And they said, nobody here is vaccinated. And I suppose he could wear a mask if he has to, because the customer is always right. So he shows up and he puts on a mask sort of halfway. And I'm wearing a mask. But then at the end, I said, thank you for wearing a mask for me. And he said, well, the customer's always right. He gave me the same rhetoric again, which is really off-putting. And I said, I'm just trying to do my best. And that caught him completely off guard, because I wasn't attacking him. I was talking about me. And this takes us back to a very fundamental belief that many, many people in this country still share. And that is that we're free. But if you're free, then that means you're responsible. So if you're not responsible, you're no longer free. And I was saying, I'm taking responsibility for this as best I can. And it may not be the right thing to do, wearing a mask. We could argue about that, but this is something I can do, and I'm just trying. And I think that that kind of language, where you reach out to the other person, and you say, I'm just trying my best. I think that dulls the sharp edge, the sharp elbows of the politicized rhetoric that we're living through right now. I'll stop there.
I'll quickly, I prepared the slide. So I'll very quickly go through perspectival, mythic, and magic consciousness, just so that our audience have some minimum understanding of these concepts. So perspectival people are very individualistic, but they're able to think objectively. They're able to make decisions without emotion getting involved. When they, but these decisions are focused on whatever the ultimate objectives that they're interested in. And oftentimes this is the goals that they pursue, right? So for example, if we offer information about how effective the vaccine is, and my goal is to protect myself, not to get sick, then I'm willing to, if there's scientific evidence that says vaccine is not effective, in fact, it's dangerous, then even though I really want a vaccine because I want to be healthy, I would be able to say no, because this is a dangerous vaccine. But at the same time, if all of a sudden there are better evidence, better studies that provide me a different incentive, that convince me that I was wrong, my identity is not involved. I'll be more than happy to change my position, because now I have another measurement, another tool that gives me the kind of answer I want to achieve by changing my behaviors. So in this sense, you see that if there are people who would not get, who are not whose measurement, whose motivation is not motivated by scientific data, but these are people who can be motivated by financial incentives, then offering incentives to these people, they're not going to feel like, oh, somehow I'm betraying my earlier belief of saying that, the vaccine is dangerous. They'll be more than happy once you find the incentives that they like and appreciate, then they will change their behavior without holding grudges, because they're also, and without thinking about the inconsistency in their behavior. They're not going to feel ashamed for changing their positions, right? They are just making the best decision based on sort of the offer that was given to them. In that sense, you can also say that perspectival people may resist vaccine as a result of FDA's emergency declaration, because they were concerned about how safe the vaccine is. But once FDA have an official regulatory approval, perspectival people will be able to say, now I'm convinced of the effectiveness and safety, and so you have proven to me and I am willing to get vaccinated. On the other hand, method connection, like Dr. Kramer said, that these are driven by shared values. So you see early on in the vaccine, in COVID health campaign, you see doctors who would appeal to the public on specific values that says, we stay at work for you, you stay at home for us. We are both making self-sacrifice, but we are together and together as a community, and we get to achieve the goals and values that we share together as a community. In that sense, in a very interesting way, whereas you don't think of perspectival people would be willing to do sacrifice for others, mythic people are committed to, they are willing to do self-sacrificial acts if it helped them to achieve the kind of value that they want to achieve, like they thought that that's good for the community. So I'm willing to wear masks, even though I hate how humid it is, if that means I get to protect my neighbors, my students. Interestingly enough, though, myth and share value can happen in different ways in different communities, right? So for another community, they may believe that, American democracy is under assault, that freedom is under assault. So I'm willing to self-sacrifice my own personal health. I know that not wearing masks is dangerous to my own personal health, but in order to make a statement, I am willing to not wear a mask as a political statement, as an ideological statement, to protect the shared value of personal autonomy, freedom. So that's why you kind of see the rally where the rally sign is, freedom. That's the value that they're pursuing. And then for magic consciousness is not, it is sort of, they're not self-reflective. They act because this is who we are. All the actions that they do is identity defining. And they're not sort of this cerebral thinkers trying to say, okay, if I do this, what happened? They do it because this is what we do. And so there's a strong unreflective bond to in-group. But because there's a strong sense of we, it creates an understanding of others. That out-group is what we're against. And so all these behaviors highlight the differences between in-group and out-group. So for people in magic community, being ostracized or excommunicated from their community is the worst kind of punishment. Your identity is stripped away. And without your people with magic, in magic community with magic consciousness, once they lose that identity, they have nothing. There's nothing, even if they have money, even if they have, other colleagues who support them and friends who support them, that's meaningless. Their identity is gone, their value is gone, they're completely lost. And so people in these communities, they do not regret the things that they do, because even with the worst consequences, as long as they are part of the community, they are good, and they will they are saved, blessed, their identity is secured. And what's happening in our current situation is that we start to see that political identity get into vaccine resistance movement. Historically, vaccine resistance is not new. This is very common. There were people who were resisting vaccine in 1918 Spanish flu. So that is not special. And traditionally, these community-based campaigns in public health were able to target the needs of people who are in perspectival thinking or people who are in mythic connection. We get to appeal, we try to interject new values, and we appeal to these people's desire to protect their community, to adopt appropriate health behavior. But because this political identity and somehow also mixture with religious identity create a very strong magic community for our current situation. So what you see is that these political identities, religious identity forms very strong and magic and mythic communities that are hard to penetrate through traditional health campaigns. And in fact, magic communities are very resistant to change, that they feel that any change will destroy, will kill their identity, eliminate their identity.
I would just add here that when we look at different types of groups on the variable from collectivistic to individualistic, one of the ways that we get people to conform to behavior is either shame, which is a collectivistic concept, or guilt, which is an individualistic concept. Getting the vaccine is a pretty individualistic activity, unless you can get like a whole church to get on a bus and go and get the vaccines together, something like that. Now, in the past, we didn't choose our communities. This is a big, big thing that has changed. We were born into a community, and we would alter our behavior based very much on stigma and shame. But now, people can find their own communities online and organize that way. And so this makes it very difficult for what would be considered a more organic community to bring to bear these really old processes for trying to get people to conform to the norms and mores of the group. Because I may live in this neighborhood, but you're not my community anymore. I've gone online to find my own community, and they don't shame me. In fact, they give me social support, psychological support. And this is part of what we're seeing. And this is a very complex admixture of a kind of fragmenting that is perspectival, that also leads people to seek out mythic groups with their own stories and their own belief systems that ultimately will give them a kind of profound idolic or magic identity. Belonging. People want to belong. And it used to be we could threaten that, the community could threaten that if you were doing things we didn't like with children or whatever. There was great shame, and that was very powerful motivator. But we're now in a situation where that's not working. And Ferdinand Tönnies talks about the difference between a modern society and a traditional community. And the old traditional community means of maintaining sort of mores and norms, that's fading. And Tönnies already saw that happening. And that leads to a kind of alienation in modern societies. And that's what we see. A lot of these people are quite alienated until and unless they find the community that agrees with them. So for instance, to give you an example, people used to be born into a church. They were born into a language, into an ethnic identity. So you're born into this church. That's your religion. Why? Because I was born here. My mom and dad go to that church, all my aunts and uncles, everybody. In the modern world, people go church shopping. They don't just accept what is given. They seek out what they want and what makes them feel good. And so one of the things we have to go back and look at is how to deal with dissonance. Because if you're trying to get people to change their behavior at such a fundamental level of values, beliefs, and attitudes, you have to take into account the dissonance they will feel. That's why people are hiding. People go out and get the vaccine, but they don't tell their family. They don't tell their community. This is very strange behavior. And it's because they're trying to avoid dissonance. Okay, I will stop there.
And another way to think about this is historically we think of the society, the American society, as a single community, right? Especially in the early on the COVID campaign, like especially when doctors say, I go to work for you, you stay at home for me. There's no understanding of these sub-communities within the larger society. But what we're seeing now is that these sub-communities, like Dr. was saying, is strengthening, and as it's strengthened, it builds on its myth and magic consciousness in that it becomes exclusive to the exclusion of others, right? That's how they build their identities, and that is really creating a difficult time for public health campaigners to create an effective message to penetrate into these communities. In addition to that, earlier I said that perspectival community people are able to their identity emotions are not involved. They see what they want to achieve, and they're able to manipulate and exploit information, messages, other people's identity to achieve what they want to achieve. And so you can see sometimes non-believers of these myth or magic communities, the non-believers, the outsider, the perspectival people, they see these myths or that they see these identity appeal, and then they would use these myths or these identity appeals to encourage others to do the things that the perspectival people want. If you're familiar with Mohan Duda's criticism about how culturally sensitive campaign can become problematic and unethical, he argued on that ground that culturally sensitive campaign, even though it tried to incorporate these communities' belief system, but ultimately the campaigners is trying to sort of acting like a I know better colonizer to tell other people how you should change, and maybe it's because you're God, like your street clean. So here they're using the community's mythic belief about gods, but trying to achieve what perspectival people want, which is to clean your street. But because these perspectival people can become very exploitatory toward other people's belief system, so you can see that they are cynic thinkers, that they would manipulate others to achieve their personal goals. So, the interesting thing about this particular chart, when I saw this cartoon, what is interesting is for the true believer of mythic thinkers, that when they die and they scream out for freedom, they meant it. They are sacrificing themselves for a value that they believe to be good for their community. Even if they die, they're protecting this value for their generation, their children to come. Except that in this process, you see that politicians are manipulating these messages that even though they themselves have gotten vaccinated, they try to say that, oh, it's individual's choice. This is a mythic appeal, or that, government cannot be trusted. This is sort of the in-group, out-group divide to reinforce mythic communities or the magic communities' belief about, what they should do for health behavior. When you look at integral approach to vaccine hesitancy, one of the things that we should recognize is that the historical community-based campaign work for perspectival and mythic communities. But the social identity theory says the stronger a person's identity, like we all have multiple identities, but the identity that we identify the most is likely to dictate our decision-making and our health behavior. So the identity that is most salient to us will influence your decision at the moment. This is why sometimes I find, like, I think that these type of headlines that, Republicans are least likely to want the coronavirus vaccine, white evangelicals' resistance is an obstacle to vaccine effort. These are factual statements, right? But if you understand how these statements are understood by mythic or magic people, this is a badge of pride. The more, like, the resisting outsiders' influence make me a better insider. That outsiders' influences are manipulative and deceptive, and they're just trying to corrupt us. More importantly, I think that these kind of headlines could create problem in that it raises certain type of identity. So maybe I'm a white Republican, but I really don't I'm not thinking about what white Republican would do when it comes to vaccine. But now that I see that, you kind of see this reverse influence of social norm. I'm telling you that people in your group do not like vaccination. So maybe then you should follow your group norm. And that can become problematic when it comes to vaccine effort. The other thing, like Dr. Kramer said, that magic consciousness is idolic communication. There isn't a whole lot difference. They mean what they say. And in that sense, that when they say that, COVID vaccine equals death, and we were like, perspectival thinkers, I can show you science that it's very safe. There's no issues about death involved in getting vaccine. It has nothing to do with political identity, this and that. But that's what perspectival thinkers think. For a magic person, if their community believes that COVID vaccine is an outsider trying to change their identity, then accepting that vaccine is the death to that community or that their community membership, right? So even if you believe that vaccine is effective, that you would like to protect yourself, getting a vaccine equals being excommunicated from your community, and that is the worst thing that could happen to a magic person, then they're going to do everything they can to minimally not let people in their community know that they have been vaccinated, because that is the most valuable identity to them. And so when in the last 2 weeks after we agree on presenting on this topic, Dr. Eric Kramer and I would talk about many times and discuss about how we can provide meaningful intervention to vaccine resistance. And we disagree sometimes, and we yell at each other sometimes. But here are some of the things that I thought may be helpful. First, we need to think about identities and how identities can be shifted. So by recognizing that there are multiple identities that a person can have, I think for mythic vaccine vaxxers, so for example, those who believe that not getting vaccine is about, protecting their individual freedom, we can shift their understanding of, getting vaccine is about protecting other people. And, you have a freedom to choose, and you choose to protect. So in some ways, then you get to accommodate their belief about their individual freedom. The freedom is about, free will is about choice. And you have a choice here and you choose to protect other people. So you get to sort of shifting the shared values, shifting or trying to integrate different type of value that some of the value would encourage them to accept vaccine. You try to shift their communities. So maybe instead of appealing, they may be thinking about their political identity as the most salient one. You bring them back to the family and say, you have family members that you need to protect. That in one of the CNN's report I thought was really cool was there was a gym bodybuilder, and he came out and he was crying, and he talked about how the most difficult part of his he after being diagnosed and being ventilated because of his COVID diagnosis was not about his personal pain, but to witness how his wife suffered, and that changed his attitude. So going back to what I said, that mythic people do not care about self-sacrifice. Sacrifice is okay. It's part of the heroic journey of protecting your value. But once we can shift their identity and sort of your community is not with this political, abstract community. You have a wife, you have children that you are connected to, then that may be able to shift their decision making in that process. For people in magic communities, that would be a little bit more difficult because their identity is directly connected to their membership in that community. So they may, it's harder to ask them to leave that community. But what we could do is we, again, help them re-identify a magic community. So here you can think about sort of like, how do we make cult members who were brainwashed into a cult reintegrated into their families and reintegrated in their society, to help them recognize that the magic identity does not necessarily need to be 100% dependent on this particular community. Second is we can call out false prophet to say that some people are just exploiting your magic belief. And if you can recognize that, maybe they will be able to change their mind about whether I should trust these people or to continue with these magic community. And finally, there's an ethical consideration. Again, health campaign people tend to believe that whatever I do, it doesn't matter, especially if you think about social marketing campaign, that they don't believe about the importance of educating people. They think that as long as I can create sort of social messaging that make people change their behavior, like Dr. Kramer earlier said, that there's this tradition coming from this ad agency that personal belief and growth is not necessarily important as long as you do the things I want. And so there is a part of health campaigners that can end up sort of adopting a similar exploitatory stance in sort of exploiting people's belief in order to make them, get vaccinated. And part of the challenge is that there's ethical issues like Mohan Duda criticized before. The other thing is sometimes we in community-based campaign, we talk about sort of recruiting community insiders. But with community insiders, what is interesting about this magic community is sometimes they turn on their leaders that if they are not consistent with their sort of magic ideology. So, interestingly, you still see sort of Trump get booed when he tell people that they should get vaccine, or a pastor of a church get fired because he told people that, getting vaccination is good. So community insider is tricky. I mean, it tend to work well with mythic communities, but when it comes to magic communities, they don't work as directly as what we typically imagine they would when you work with church leaders. So, but nevertheless, Dr. Eric Kramer and I both agree that when you can, a really solid way of changing magic community for good is through community insiders, that they must themselves start to reflect about their ideology and belief. And for me as a public health intervention expert, I prefer sort of immediate intervention, right? So let's talk to, religious leaders, see if they could make a difference. But I think Dr. Eric Kramer's suggestion in our earlier conversation was right, that we have to focus on the next generation. When you can change children, maybe those people can be the future insider majority in that magic community. So that brings us to sort of our recommendation in the book when it comes to health intervention, that an integral fusion approach is a particular type of approach that we respect other people's cultural attitude and cultural perspectives, so that you recognize what is driving people's understanding about relationships and their perception of reality. And instead of doing what perspectival people do, which is to exploit those beliefs to achieve what you want them to do, an integral fusion appreciate these perspectives and try to find ways to accommodate and honor those perspectives while finding a common ground, a consensus in that community. So that, kind of like Dr. Kramer earlier said, that, there was a time where we have a common language that Republicans, Democrats use, that when they talk as one single community members, as opposed to two separate opposing groups that hates one another. So maybe in that sense, creating common ground, creating agreeable consensus, that we don't have to agree with each other together, but we share the same value and principles that for our common goal. And like I said, in this process, I think what is important for health interventionists is to be attentive to the kind of intervention to be ethical and not to be exploitive. That's all I have.
I wanted to add something here, something that I've been tracking a little bit. There's a new online phenomenon where on Instagram and other social media, where people are tracking the dead. And they're finding portraits of people who used to be staunch anti-vaxxers on Facebook or on their Instagram or whatever, who got COVID, got very ill, and then died. And now they're posting lists of people, and you can find these where they have a photograph of the person, a quote from what they said about the hoax of the virus or whatever, and then the date and time they died of COVID. And I know there's a lot of frustration and anger out there among especially medical professionals. My son is a physician. We used his picture. He works in Seattle, and he gets very frustrated sometimes with what he sees. But what we're beginning to see is a kind of really cruel mocking of death, a disenfranchised kind of death. It's sort of like when somebody says, well, my father died of lung cancer. The first question you ask is, did he smoke? And if he did smoke, was a heavy smoker, then people have this attitude, well, he deserved it. And if we believe that a lot of these people are not ignorant and that they're sincere, then we have to assume that they have somehow been misled. And we can't lose our humanity in this process. If we do that, then we have totally othered them and said, well, you deserve to die this horrible death on a ventilator where, the last time you spoke to your family was just before you were intubated, and you said goodbye. So I think that we have to be very careful in our tactics in trying to push back against this, that we don't dehumanize the other. Because if we do that, then the common ground is completely gone. They're other completely, and they deserve to die. And it's funny they died this way, and it's good, and let's mock them.
Well, thank you both for sharing your research and your findings with us, for making recommendations to us about what we can do to try and help in our communities. I haven't seen any questions come in from the audience so far. We do have a couple of minutes left in which we could potentially take a question or two. As we are waiting on that, I wonder if Val, who has also been working on this event behind the scenes, might want to ask one of the questions that she and I were thinking about.
Dr. Hsieh and Dr. Kramer, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. I was wondering, in terms of the whole idea of magic consciousness and mythic consciousness and then perspectivalism, how does this, do you see this happen in cross-cultural contexts as well, especially as it relates to vaccines? And if so, what does that look like in other parts of the world?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the suppositions, somebody just asked the question, what was the data collected for this? The primary theory was built out of many years by several researchers looking at comparative legal systems, comparative psychologies, comparative religion, comparative arts, comparative philosophies coming out of Europe. There was a cadre of several researchers throughout the 20th and 21st century gathering data. And then I took that and I decided that I wanted to make it into a communication theory. So initially it was a comparative, it was a sort of phenomenology where there was a magic consciousness, a mythic consciousness, a perspectival consciousness, but I was looking at how this correlates in how we communicate. So I talked about idolic, symbolic, and signalic communication. Idolic communication does not have any dissociation. In other words, the statue is not a representative of God. The statue of Ganesh is God. And so if you pick up the statue and walk away, people will be very emotional with you because where are you going with Ganesh? It's like a holy relic in the Catholic Church. The holy relic, the bone of a saint or a piece of the cross, this is literally what it is. It is self-evident. It's not symbolic. It is what it is. And if you lose it, it's gone. It's irreplaceable. And so there's a great deal of emotion attached to things like this. Mythic communication is symbolic. You start to see dissociation enter into the communication process so that you now have something that stands in for something else that's absent. That's symbolism. The symbol is not literally the thing. And then when you get to the signalic, you have a totally arbitrary process. And you look at linguistics, for instance, de Saussure and others, they talk about language as being totally arbitrary. Words have no inherent value or inherent relationship to the thing that they signify. You have the signifier and the signified is very dualistic. And in that sense, we don't care. I don't care. You can call it a shoe or an arbor or a tree. One is Chinese, one is French, and one is English. I don't care, just as long as we understand each other. But when you go back to the magic level, we care a lot. because it's not arbitrary. And so one of the things I try to talk about is that in cultures around the world, you see elements of all of these. None is superior to the other. But they tend to look at each other and understand each other in the only way they know how. So the magic person may see, like the cargo cults, he may see an airplane and think it's something that is divine because it can fly and carry people and goods. They make sense. It's basic hermeneutics. We make sense of things the only way we know how. The mythic person may tell stories of heroes and evildoers, good and evil, and it's very polaristic. Symbolism is polar, perspectival is binary. It's oppositional. And so if we can reach out and try to get to know people who disagree with us and understand how they're making sense of this, then you begin to also realize that there is, in hermeneutic terms, a sedimentation. We didn't get here overnight. These cultures have sedimented over a long period of time for individuals. That's why there's an inertia to it. It's very hard to change people quickly, or for them to change you. You may just sort of be smug or whatever and think, well, they're stupid, But so the perspectival person would look at the magic person and say, well, you're inferior because you don't have massive technological complexes like we do. We have satellites and we dam rivers and we can move mountains and turn entire forests into marketable lumber, things like that. But then the magic person looks at that and says, but you're a profanity. The reason you can do this to the river and to the mountain is because you don't see them as alive anymore. So as dissociation increases, as dimensionality increases, dissociation increases. And what happens is you go from animism to pantheism, ultimately to monotheism, to no gods. You go from all the people are the people to tribalism, to clans, to extended families, to nuclear families, to the individual, and then the individual is lost. You can see how this manifests across many different institutions and processes in society. So as you approach the perspectival, we become more technologically powerful because we don't care. The forest has no value, no inherent value at all. I have to add value. How do I do that? I have to turn it into a commodity. And until and unless I do that, it has no value. But for the magic person, the forest has a spirit. Well, I think that's silly superstition. That's nonsense. But to the magic person, I'm crazy. So we look at each other like we're both crazy and we're in the same asylum. And until we can get to a more integral approach where we can start to appreciate each other and come to understand the comparative hermeneutics, until we can get there, then we're just going to be talking past each other and seeing each other as fools and ignorant and evil even.
That's helpful to think about things in terms of needing to have kind of a hermeneutics of grace toward others as well in approaching the subject. We are at the end of the scheduled time. We had one more question come in from Dr. Thornton, so I thought that we would go ahead and ask that one. So he mentioned that there are several pockets in Nevada on both the left and the right refusing the vaccine, and asked if there's anyone tracking who is disregarding Biden's request to be vaccinated instead of just tracking the lack of enthusiasm from the right wing.
I don't know of anybody who's doing that personally.
I want to sort of respond to both Chris's earlier comment about data and Tyler's actually together. One of the things we really try to avoid is using sort of identity label to segment a particular group. So even though we did use like political identity a lot, and these talk highlighted sort of the GOP identity, I want to argue that, not all GOP people are magic thinkers. Some GOP people are still perspectival thinkers. And similarly, there are also, Democrats who are magic thinkers or mythic thinkers. So, in that sense, the way we identify, going back to Chris's question, how do we collect data? Instead of saying how we collect data, I will say we use sort of discourse to look at these thinking process, the cultural consciousness. What kind of discourse tells me that a person is evoking a magic identity versus a mythic identity versus a perspectival identity? These people talk very differently about their decision making. So with magic, you see this appeal of social share values, but with magic, you tend to see this drive on in-group, out-group, and how bad out-group behavior is, how important in-group loyalty is. So within the current atmosphere, Biden's can be used as a marker for in-group, out-group divide, right? And if people talk about Biden that way, then we would know that this is a person appealing to magic identity in their decision-making process. On the other hand, if people are talking about Biden doesn't have enough evidence, like right now, the debate is about whether Biden has enough evidence to advocate for a booster shot and how he may have said it too early without scientific evidence. If a person says, I'm not getting that booster because I don't trust Biden on this, CDC hasn't said anything about it, and even the director overruled the panel decision. So I kind of feel like there isn't scientific consensus, and I'm making my independent decision about what kind of scientific information and authority I'm going to trust, as opposed to Biden say this, so I'm going to do it that way. People who says Biden say this, so I'm going to do it that way, is really sort of borderlining on the magic identity with this Biden community. Whereas another person says, I decided not to get, even though I'm a Democrat, but I'm not getting the booster because I just don't trust the science on it. This person is evoking a perspectival thinking in their decision making. So one thing that is really good about this approach is that while we recognize that people can appeal to different ways, but because they're using discourse to evoke these cultural identities, so they can be identified, and then that process will so you can shift. A person can have both magic identity, right? I feel very closely tied to my children. That's a magic identity and magic community. But at the same time, I'm a perspectival thinker when it comes to science and research. So if I can switch people's understanding about vaccine decision belongs to this mythic and perspectival ways of thinking as opposed to magic, then that may able to help them make the kind of decision that is more beneficial to the larger society. And so in that sense, the data can be collected anywhere, but our analytical process is we look at individuals' way of how they evoke their cultural attitudes and what kind of relationship and identity is implied to know what kind of group that they are. And so, I agree with Taylor that, both not 100% of Democrats have been vaccinated, but I think that people choose not to be vaccinated for different reasons. But I think perspectival and mythic can be reached by traditional campaign. Magic, we need more thinking and figure out a way to talk to them to avoid, kind of like Dr. Kramer said, to minimize that in-group, out-group divide, and sort of interject in a way for them to recognize that even though we're different, we're still one community, as opposed to treat me as an out-group and don't trust anything I say.
Very helpful. Thank you, Dr. Hsieh. We appreciate both of you taking time to share what you've learned with us. This is going to bring us to the end of the time for our session. I learned a lot. I was very excited to be able to hear from y'all. And again, to our audience members, thank you so much for being here with us. If you want to follow or get involved in the work that's being done to support peace and sustainability, both here and around the world, that we can start some of that work here in this community, please check out OU Center for Peace and Development and the Security and Context Initiative. And we hope that we'll see you around at future events. Val, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I just want to echo what you said and just express our appreciation to Dr. Hsieh and Dr. Kramer and to OUCPD and SIC for granting us the platform to be able to discuss this very important topic and reach people on a different level of thinking about these issues and from a different perspective, especially also from a communication perspective, looking at these things from the way we study it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for inviting us.
Bye-bye.